Hi, welcome to this week's edition of Imago's Vlog. My name is Donovan, the pastor for preaching at Imago Christi Church. This is where you have an opportunity to submit questions, and we'll be answering them through video on a weekly basis. You can submit those questions to gladchurch@gmail.com. The question for this week is, how do we share the love of Jesus with our homosexual friends? Very relevant question, very tough question for the church today. Christian church has a long history of either not dealing well with this issue, coming across and being perceived as unloving, and I think that the Bible, particularly Jesus, has something to say about this situation. And I want to encourage Christians out there to be willing to receive a rebuke, and I also want to encourage non-Christians or people who are either tempted with homosexuality or wrestling with those kind of temptations to be willing to consider the claims of Christ. So Christians and non-Christians, I believe, and we always believe, need to listen to Jesus, right? So, again, the question, how do we share, this is Christians, the love of Jesus with our homosexual friends? Let me just start by saying that that's a bit like asking, how do we share the love of Jesus with our greedy friends? How do we share the love of Jesus with our impatient friends? Now, the way I just phrased that can be offensive to both parties, because homosexuals or people who are friendly to that type of lifestyle would say, you're equating homosexuality with greed, impatience, and those kind of improper behaviors. And I would say, yes, I am. And that's based on the scriptures where we believe that it's an appropriate lifestyle, an inappropriate lifestyle. And I'll speak a little more to that. But I also want you to hear that what I'm saying to Christians is be careful that you don't say, you don't put homosexuality in this category all by itself as though, well, how do I deal with homosexuals? Well, here's the deal. This is what Romans 3:23 tells us. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, including you, Christian. And what that means is that every aspect of your life is impacted by the fact that we're not fully loving God and fully loving people at all times. We've fallen short of that, and therefore it bears fruit in what we call sin. It can bear fruit in sexual relationships. It can bear fruit in personal friendships. It can bear fruit in work relationships. And it leads to all kinds of disorder, like homosexuality, and even heterosexual sin, like adultery, lust outside of the marriage relationship, all kinds of things, and other things like greed, impatience, and anger. So really what you're asking is, how do we share the love of Christ with sinners? Well, number one, you keep Romans 3:23 in mind, which says, all have fallen short of the glory of God, namely you. What that does is it humbles you. It brings everyone back to the, there's a great song that calls it the level ground. Standing at the foot of the cross, there's level ground. We see that humanity is so sinful that God had to die for us. So no one gets to stand up and go, oh, well, the homosexuals, oh, we're the Republicans, oh, well, the liberals, oh, everyone goes, okay, God, speak to us. We have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Another important point in there is to remember that sexual sin does not just play itself out in homosexual behaviors. It also plays itself out in heterosexual behaviors, which I already touched on. Things like adultery, incest, child molestation, premarital sex. So everyone, really, what we're contending is that our sexuality is something that's given to us by God, is meant to function a certain way, which is monogamous marriage between a man and a woman for life. And everyone has fallen short of that. And Jesus says, even if you lust after a woman, you're an adulterer. So no one gets to take the high ground on sexual morality. Everyone falls short of the glory of God. The next thing to keep in mind is that though all have fallen short of the glory of God, I believe what we're called to do is extend friendship and relationship and love to people who are sinners because we are sinners. Jesus says in Matthew 7:1, judge not that you not be judged. What's interesting is right after that, he talks about, listen to what he says. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye? In other words, some sin that he has, and he calls it a speck, but you do not notice the big giant log in your eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye? It's kind of funny. But what he's saying is you have sin. Everyone has sin. But here's really what's interesting is he says, in the first sentence he says, judge not that you not be judged. We generally mean that to take that to mean, well, we shouldn't discern whether or not what other people are doing is wrong or right. Well, that's not what Jesus is saying, obviously, because he says immediately, you see your brother has a speck in his eye, take yours out first. This is what he says. You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So he's saying there are specks and logs. Let's be honest about that. There are things that are wrong, things we need to speak about into each other's lives. But what we need to do is judge not. And what that means is don't put yourself in a place where you are on higher ground. Don't separate from that person. Don't put them in the sinner category, you in the holy category, where now you are judging and being separate. Just don't do that. Come to the foot of the cross. Everyone's equal, and maintain that relationship. So back to the original question, I wanted to lay some general groundwork, but how do you share the love of God with homosexual friends then? Well, number one, you don't break a relationship with them because of their homosexual practices. There's some exceptions to that if you feel that you're being tempted into that, or there's some inappropriate ways that that's playing out in your life, influencing your children maybe. But in general, it means love that person. Can you have coffee with the homosexual? Do you work with the homosexual and you believe their lifestyle is wrong, but you can still love them, confer dignity upon them, and say, hey, I disagree with your lifestyle, but I love you, Bill, and I want to know about your life, and I want to know your story. Can you do that? If you can't do that, you're not going to do very good at sharing the love of Jesus with your homosexual friends. Lastly, let me say, what you want to do is operate constantly from a gospel narrative, or to remain gospel-centered, or be functionally gospel-centered. What we mean by that is that everyone is operating from a certain worldview. And there's either a grace narrative or a works righteousness narrative. A works righteousness narrative has at its root, my value, my dignity comes from my performance. And so do other people's. So then when I think that my performance is better than other people's, I can help but look down my nose at them. But if I have a grace narrative, in other words, my worldview at its root says, no, 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 everything that I have, all my gifts, all my blessings, I have nothing to do with the fact that I've earned them, but it's all a gift from God that keeps me humble, it keeps me thankful, keeps me rejoicing, and now it empowers me to go out and share the love of God with other people. You see this in Galatians 2, and I want to encourage you, if you're a Christian and you failed at this, because even the great Apostle Peter failed at this. Apostle Peter, in the book of Galatians, Paul tells a story about how Peter started being judgmental against some of the Gentiles, the non-Jews, when other Jews came around. So Peter's hanging out with Gentiles, sinners, and other Jews come around, and Peter gets nervous and afraid of what they'll think, so he withdraws from them. He separates the relationship. And Paul rebukes him. He says, there's a speck in your eye, right, Peter? He says, you're not walking in step with the truth of the gospel, which is that you have a grace narrative and that you're called to extend love to all people. If you do, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? Here's basically what he said. Peter, walk in line with the gospel. You're a sinner saved by grace, the grace of Jesus Christ. Jesus came, lived the life you should have lived, died the death you should have died. Yes, you're so sinful, Peter, that God had to die for you, but you're so loved that he was glad to die for you. So rejoice, lift your head up, and go and eat with sinners.